I did not expect my own daughter to hand me a name tag that said, "Mom, retired," and seat me at the far end of the reception hall like a coat someone had forgotten to pick up. But that is exactly what happened the night my daughter stood in front of 300 guests at her company's annual gala and introduced me as the woman who used to make her school lunches. I still remember the weight of the crystal glass in my hand, the chandelier light catching every surface in the room, and the way her voice carried easily over the soft music when she said it. She was smiling. She always smiled when she was performing for a crowd. And I sat at table 16, near the emergency exit, and told myself to breathe. Then a woman in a charcoal blazer stood up from the front of the room. She did not raise her hand or wait to be introduced. She simply stood, looked directly at me across the length of the hall, and said 6 words that stopped every conversation within earshot. "I have been looking for you." Chairs shifted, heads turned. My daughter's smile flickered like a candle in a draft, and the woman began walking toward me with the kind of calm that belongs to people who have never once doubted their own direction. What happened next turned the most quietly humiliating evening of my life into something I am still learning how to carry. My name is Dorothy Calloway, and for most of my life I was exactly what people assumed I was, a practical woman from a small city in Ontario. The kind of person who shows up early, stays late, and never once asks to be noticed for it. I grew up in Sudbury, the middle child of 5, in a house where resourcefulness was not a virtue so much as a requirement. My mother worked at the hospital laundry. My father drove for the paper mill. We were not poor in the way that makes for dramatic stories, but we were careful. Careful with money, careful with words, careful with hope. I married when I was 24. His name was Gerald, and he was not a cruel man, only a limited one. He believed that a woman's intelligence was a pleasant accessory, the way some men think of a well-kept garden. Nice to look at, but not something to build a life around. When I mentioned going back to school after our daughter was born, he nodded in the way people nod at children who say they want to be astronauts. Patient, indulgent, certain it would pass. It did not pass. But life got louder, and I got quieter about it. Our daughter, Stephanie, came first. Then the mortgage. Then Gerald's layoff, which lasted 2 years and cost us the savings we had barely started. I took a full-time position at a manufacturing supply company outside of Hamilton, doing inventory coordination. It was not glamorous work. There were spreadsheets and purchase orders and suppliers who called too early and too often. But I was good at it, and being good at something practical felt like its own kind of dignity. By the time Stephanie was in high school, Gerald and I had quietly agreed that we had grown into different people. The divorce was almost polite. He moved to Calgary. I stayed in the house, refinanced twice, and raised our daughter on a budget that required the kind of math most people never think to learn. Stephanie was sharp from the beginning, the kind of child who argued about the reasoning behind rules rather than just the rules themselves. I was proud of that. I encouraged her to push back, to question, to want more than I had settled for. I drove her to every debate competition in a 3-hour radius. I proofread her university applications with a red pen and genuine hope. When she got into business school in Toronto, I stood in the parking lot of our old house and let myself cry for a full 5 minutes before I went back inside to start dinner. She built something real, a career in corporate events and brand partnerships, the kind of work that involves glass towers and conference rooms and dinners at restaurants where the menu has no prices. I was proud of all of it. I still am. But somewhere in the climb, I think she started to see me the way some people see the town they grew up in. Familiar, useful once, a little embarrassing now. I retired from the supply company at 62, 31 years with the same employer. My farewell gathering was a Thursday afternoon in the break room. Someone ordered a vegetable tray. My name was spelled correctly on the cake, which felt like a small mercy. Stephanie sent flowers, which was kind. She did not come, which was also not surprising. She had a product launch that weekend in Vancouver. Important things happened constantly in her world, and my 31 years somehow never quite rose to that level. I drove home to my house, which had been just mine for nearly 2 decades by then, and sat at the kitchen table in the particular silence of a life between chapters. The refrigerator hummed. The neighbor's dog barked twice and stopped. I made a pot of tea I did not finish and thought about what it meant to have spent so many years being useful to other people's goals. I had carried something with me since I was in my late 20s, a notebook, not always the same one, but always the same intention. I had a mind that noticed patterns, systems, the way things connected when most people only saw isolated parts. For years, I had been applying that mind to other people's inventory problems. That evening, I decided to apply it to something I had been turning over quietly for years. There was a problem I had watched the manufacturing sector ignore for a long time. Small suppliers, the kind who produced specialized components for larger assembly operations, had almost no efficient way to manage compliance documentation across provincial lines. Every time regulations changed, which happened more than most people realized, these companies scrambled. They hired consultants who charged more than the companies could absorb. They made errors. They lost contracts. I had watched it happen from the inside for 3 decades, and I had a very clear picture of why it kept happening and what a better system might look like. I did not call it a business idea at first. I called it a project, the way women of my generation often soften things before we believe we are allowed to take them seriously. I spent the first 6 months reading regulatory frameworks, software development basics, existing compliance tools, and their limitations. I had no background in technology, but I had always been a fast and thorough reader, and I treated every document like a purchase order I needed to fully understand before signing. I filled 4 notebooks. I drew diagrams on graph paper. I asked questions in online forums under a username that had nothing to do with my real name, partly for privacy and partly because I was not yet ready to be someone who asked questions like that out loud. By the end of that first year, I had a working concept, a streamlined compliance tracking system designed specifically for mid-sized manufacturing suppliers operating across multiple Canadian provinces. I knew what it needed to do. I did not yet know how to build it. That was when I found a woman named Patricia, who was 58, recently laid off from a software firm in Kitchener, and who responded to my post in a local business forum with 3 sentences that told me she understood exactly what I was describing. We met for coffee at a Tim Hortons on a Tuesday morning and talked for 4 hours. By the end of that meeting, we had agreed to split the development work and the eventual ownership equally. Patricia built what I designed. I tested it against every real-world scenario I had lived through in 31 years of supply chain work. We called it ClearPath. It was not a flashy name, but it was accurate, which mattered more to us than clever. We filed for incorporation in the fall. I used a portion of my pension savings to cover the initial costs, which was either brave or reckless depending on the day. Stephanie knew I was working on something. I told her it was a consulting project. I did not want to hear the careful, gentle version of her father's astronaut nod. The first client came through a former colleague who had moved to a fastener manufacturer in Cambridge. He called me because he was drowning in compliance renewals and remembered that I was the person who always seemed to know how to make complicated things workable. By the end of that first call, I had sold a 12-month service agreement. Patricia and I sat on my porch afterward and shared a bottle of wine we had been saving for exactly this kind of occasion. More clients followed, slowly at first, then with the kind of momentum that feels less like success and more like proof that the problem you identified was real and widespread. By the end of our 3rd year, ClearPath had 46 active clients across Ontario, Quebec, and Alberta. Industry associations had started referencing our documentation in their own guidance materials. A regulatory consultant in Ottawa had called Patricia to ask if we were open to a licensing conversation. We were not yet ready for that conversation, but I wrote down the date and the name and kept the notes in the second drawer of my desk next to the original graph paper diagrams. Stephanie did not know most of this. I mentioned ClearPath in passing occasionally, the way one mentions a sourdough starter or a renovation project, and she responded with the same polite interest she gave those things. She had built her own world and she was very busy inside it. I understood that. I did not hold it against her. but I also stopped volunteering information about what I was doing, because there is only so many times you can watch someone not quite see you before you learn to stop raising your hand. The invitation to her company's annual gala arrived by email in September. Stephanie's firm handled events for major corporate clients, and this dinner was their flagship showcase. She called to tell me about it on a Sunday morning, and I could hear the efficiency in her voice, the way she moved through calls like a list. She said she wanted me there. She said it would be good exposure, which I thought was an interesting word to use about one's own mother. She said she would handle everything, the hotel, the car, all of it. I said yes, because she was my daughter, and because I still believed, even then, that she occasionally needed me to show up, even when she did not know how to ask for it in the right way. The 3 weeks before the gala were not my weeks, they were hers. She called with questions about dietary restrictions for a table of 10, asked me to confirm the floral delivery window with a vendor who kept missing her calls, and at one point sent me a 40-line spreadsheet of guest dietary restrictions to cross-reference against the caterer's menu. I did it between client calls of my own. I said nothing about the overlap because old habits do not unknot themselves overnight, and saying no to your children when they need you still requires a kind of muscle memory I was only beginning to develop. The evening before the gala, I was in the hotel room she had booked for me, reviewing a new client proposal on my laptop when she knocked on my door. She was wearing the blazer she always wore when she wanted to seem in control of something. She looked around at my papers and my tea and my reading glasses and said, with genuine affection, that she did not know how I kept myself so busy. The way she said it, I realized she thought I was doing puzzles. I closed my laptop and asked how she was feeling about tomorrow. She sat on the edge of the bed and talked about the client list, the keynote speaker, the seating chart she had revised 4 times. Then she paused and said, almost as an aside, that she had added a small segment to the program, a light-hearted moment before the dessert course. She was going to invite guests to share something about a family member. A gratitude gesture, she called it. I thought that sounded kind. I should have asked more questions. The gala itself was the kind of event Stephanie was genuinely talented at building. The venue was a converted heritage building in downtown Toronto, and she had filled it with the right combination of warmth and polish. Guests moved easily through the cocktail hour. The dinner service was seamless. I sat at table 16 with 2 procurement managers from a firm in Mississauga and their spouses, and we had a pleasant enough conversation about the highway construction on the 401 and the unusually warm October they'd been having. Then came the segment Stephanie had mentioned. She took the microphone with the ease of someone who had been comfortable in front of crowds since she was arguing in school gymnasiums. She thanked her team, thanked the clients, and then said she wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the people behind the people in the room. She said she would start with her own. I felt a small warmth then, a mother's reflex. She gestured toward my table. 300 heads turned. She said, with a smile I knew she meant warmly, that her mother was here tonight, that her mother had retired 2 years ago after decades of very dedicated administrative work, that her mother was someone who had spent her whole life taking care of the details so that others could focus on the bigger picture, that she hoped we would all raise a glass to the quiet, steady support that makes ambitious people possible. Then she said, and I will carry this sentence for a long time, that she was grateful her mother had enough time in her retirement to help out with events like tonight. That it was sweet, really, how much her mom enjoyed staying involved. There was applause. Warm, well-meaning, completely certain of what I was. I kept my hands folded in my lap. I kept my face composed in the way I had learned to compose it over 64 years of being underestimated by people who loved me. But underneath that composure was something sharp and tired, the particular exhaustion of a woman who has built something real in plain sight and still been seen as someone filling her afternoons. Stephanie raised her glass. The room raised theirs. A few people near me smiled at me the way people smile at children being talked about in the third person. Then the woman in the charcoal blazer stood up. She was at table 3, near the front, which told me she was a significant client or a senior partner at one of Stephanie's key accounts. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of posture that comes from years of walking into rooms where people were not expecting her. She did not ask for the microphone, she simply stood and let her voice carry, which it did without effort. She said she wanted to add something to the moment. She looked at me, not at Stephanie, not at the room, but at me specifically. She said her name was Vivienne Marchetti and that she was the head of strategic acquisitions at a national manufacturing consortium based out of Calgary. She said that her team had spent the better part of 6 months attempting to reach the founders of a compliance technology company called ClearPath, and that she had nearly flown to Kitchener that afternoon to knock on the office door herself. The room was very quiet. She said that ClearPath had become the most referenced compliance management tool in the sector guidance materials her consortium worked with, that 3 of her member companies had independently recommended it in their annual operational reviews, that her organization had been authorized to explore an acquisition or a long-term licensing partnership, and that the number they were prepared to discuss began at $4 million. She paused. Then she said she was mentioning this now because she had just realized that one of the 2 founders of ClearPath was sitting at table 16, and that Stephanie's description of her mother's retirement activities had been, with respect, somewhat incomplete. The silence lasted perhaps 4 seconds. Then it cracked open. I watched the procurement managers at my table pull out their phones. I watched Stephanie's expression move through several things in rapid succession, none of which I had seen on her face before. I watched Vivienne Marchetti walk toward me with her hand extended and a directness in her eyes that I found immediately comfortable. She said simply that she was glad she had found me. I shook her hand. My own was steady. Around us, the room had shifted entirely. People who had smiled at me with gentle pity 20 minutes earlier were now leaning toward their neighbors and speaking in low, urgent voices. Someone at a nearby table was describing ClearPath to their companion with a familiarity that told me they had used it. A woman from Stephanie's team had turned around in her chair and was looking at me with an expression I can only describe as recalibration. Stephanie had not moved from the front of the room. She was still holding her glass but not drinking from it. I excused myself from the table and walked to the side of the room. Vivienne followed, and we spoke quietly for 15 minutes about ClearPath, about the consortium, about what an acquisition conversation might look like, and what a licensing structure might preserve. She gave me her card. I gave her Patricia's contact information along with my own. We agreed to set up a formal call within the week. When I returned to my table, the procurement manager on my left introduced himself again, properly this time, and handed me his card. Stephanie found me near the coat room at the end of the evening. The guests were filtering out, and the event staff were moving through the room with the practiced efficiency she had hired them for. She looked the way she had looked at 16 when she came home, having said something she could not take back, uncertain whether to apologize or explain herself first. I did not rescue her from the silence. She said she did not know. I told her I understood that. She said she should have asked. She said she had assumed, and that she had made that assumption out loud in front of 300 people, and she was sorry. I told her the apology was a beginning. She asked how long I had been working on ClearPath, and I told her nearly 5 years. I watched her do the math and understand what that meant. What it meant was that she had been nodding politely at a company in progress at every family dinner for 5 years. That she had asked me to cross-reference dietary spreadsheets and confirm florist delivery windows during the same period that I was negotiating client contracts and building something her industry had noticed before she did. She sat down on a bench near the coat room and put her face in her hands briefly. When she looked up, her eyes were wet. She said she had learned her disregard from her father, that she had internalized his way of seeing me without ever meaning to, and that she was ashamed of it. I told her I did not need shame from her. I needed something more durable than shame. She asked what that was. I told her I needed her to understand that a woman's life does not pause when she stops being useful in the ways her children can see, that retirement is not the end of a person's story, that the years I spent being practical for other people's ambitions were not the whole of what I was, only the part that was visible to those who never thought to look further. She nodded. She did not say anything, but it was the kind of nodding that means the words are actually landing. I told her I loved her. I told her that had never been in question for a single day of her life. She said she loved me too, and that she was going to do better. I believed she was going to try. And trying, when it comes from a real place, is where better things begin. The following Tuesday, Patricia and I had a call with Vivienne Marchetti and 2 members of her consortium's legal team. The conversation was long, detailed, and entirely serious. By the end of it, we had agreed to enter a formal due diligence process. Patricia called me afterward and said, in her very dry way, that she supposed the gala had been useful after all. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, in the same chair where I had first started filling graph paper notebooks with diagrams of a problem I believed I could solve. I made tea. I looked at the original notebook, still in the second drawer, and thought about the version of myself who had written in it without being certain anyone would ever care what it said. She had been right to keep going. She had been right not to wait for permission. There is something I want to say to anyone reading this who recognizes that particular exhaustion, the one that comes from being seen as the sum of your most visible usefulness rather than the whole of who you are. Your work does not require an audience to be real. Your ideas do not require endorsement from the people who love you to have value. The years you spend being the person who handles the details, drives the carpool, stays late, refinances quietly, and smiles through retirement parties where your name is misspelled on the cake, those years are not wasted years. They are years in which you are also becoming someone. The becoming does not stop simply because no one is watching. Ambition does not have an expiry date. Competence does not retire when you do. And the woman who sat at table 16 near the emergency exit, who spent 40 years being underestimated by people who meant well, was the same woman who built something $4 million worth of people wanted a piece of. You do not need to be discovered to be real, but if someone stands up in a room and names what you have built, I hope you are sitting there with steady hands, ready to shake theirs. And to the daughters and sons who have been nodding politely at their parents' projects while assuming the shape of a life you never actually looked at closely, it is not too late to look. What you find might surprise you. What you find might change the way you understand love, work, and what it means to have been raised by someone who never once stopped building, even when no one thought to ask what she was building toward.